It's time to experience the O on the Original Sports Podcast. Here's your host, Mark Maraday.
Original Sports Podcast. I am honored and pleased to present to you Rocky Bleier, four-time Super Bowl champion, current financial guy. That's his career now. And former NFL player. Rocky, how is life treating you today in the Steel City?
Well, I can't complain. You know, we got through this past year with this pandemic all in one piece. I got my shots, so I feel great about that. Yeah. And hopefully we get through it and things get back to some normalcy, as we say, not only in your profession, but in all our professions. And sure. We get to interact with people. So things here in Pittsburgh are great, and especially with my family. They're wonderful.
Moderna or Pfizer?
Pfizer.
Yeah, I had Moderna. Right. It doesn't matter as long as we got our shots.
That's right, as long as you got it. Yeah.
Yep. Hey, I want to start out by talking to you a little bit. I'm going to make you think really hard here. Let's throw it way back. Why'd you pick Notre Dame coming out of high school? I know you were from Appleton, Wisconsin?
That's correct. No, it was an interesting choice, I think, or along the way, because it wasn't a automatic choice. Now, I have to just tell you that as a background. Yes, I was, cradle Catholic born. We went to Catholic grade school, went to Catholic high school. And so we had very successful programs. And because of that, you get recognized for your contribution to the team and so on. Sure. And so I would get, and this was all new stuff, I would get, unlike today, and maybe let's put this into perspective, unlike today with all the media coverage that takes place and the instant communication, and everybody knows what's happening and so on. It wasn't that way back in the old days.
Yeah.
And so I would get letters, from some colleges, that were interested and so on, and make a visit to those schools. Now, all right. University of Wisconsin, because I was raised in Appleton, Wisconsin. Sure. There was an interest there by them, but I didn't have really an interest to kind of go any other place. I didn't think about like Minnesota or Illinois or Indiana or any of the Big Ten schools. Yeah. Notre Dame had contacted me, and I wasn't necessarily big Notre Dame fans. I should say this: we weren't big anybody fans at that time. Okay. And only because you just were, you were in your own neighborhood. You grew up and what was important was your high school team and what you did then and so on and so on. Anyway, really it was the assistant coach for Notre Dame who recruited in Wisconsin. And so he'd stop or we'd call and he probably gave me the best piece of advice. And he said, listen, you're going to get a lot of offers from different schools. And every time you go visit that school, obviously they're going to roll out the red carpet, show you the best of the best, a good time. And so by the time you have to make that decision, and you went to 5, 6, 7, 8 different schools, how are you going to define that red carpet? Because they're all going to be the same. He said, my suggestion would be to pick 3 schools that you would like to graduate from. Not play football at, graduate from. He said, because anything can happen within your career. You can get hurt, but the most important thing is getting that education down the line. Yeah. And I thought that made obvious sense to me. And so in my choice, obviously one was to go to Notre Dame to visit them. To the University of Wisconsin, I felt I owed it to my state. And then growing up in the bar business, my dad had a bar and we lived there at the place. There was a patron that had gone to Boston College, and he said, I think I can get you an interview at Boston College. Yeah. So I went out to Boston College. Notre Dame was first. And then I went to the University of Wisconsin, and then I went to Boston College. Loved Boston. Not necessarily Boston College, but Boston only because it was the East and so on. Yeah. And then Wisconsin seemed like a little big. I don't know. It just didn't grab me. But I did what every good Catholic boy was taught to do at that time. And that was what? To go to church. Right. You know, and pray for guidance and direction and so on.
Yeah.
And then, like every good Catholic boy, I did what my mother wanted me to do. And that was to go to Notre Dame. So she had a big influence in that decision. But I had gone to Notre Dame, was small at the time. There were one of the kids that showed me around, his name was Tom Regner. He was from Wisconsin himself. That's what they like to do. I thought, oh, okay, fine. You know, it fit me, fit my personality, maybe at that time. And so I made my choice to
was that Parsegian? Who was the head coach then?
Yeah, so it was Ara Parsegian was his first, and that was his first year. I was in his first recruiting class.
Wow.
To go to Notre Dame. So what you have to put in perspective was that Notre Dame at that time, or in my lifetime, in the 50s, did not exceed at all. I mean, they 52, 53 were fine, and then all of a sudden they kind of hit a lull and just weren't winning games and so on. So sure. Even by 1960, 61, 60, in high school, they weren't playing in bowl games or any of that. They didn't at that time. So I didn't know much about Notre Dame, except there was Lindsey Nelson, Sunday mornings for an hour. They had the Notre Dame game recap. They had a great PR campaign going, even during those years when they weren't winning. And so, but anyway, I went to Notre Dame. I can remember my first experience on campus with my classmates. So I mean, now all those freshmen that had been recruited, and we had a luncheon together, and I sat down and I looked at this table with players on both sides of this long table, and I thought to myself, what am I doing here? I mean, these people like they were big. I mean, they looked like guys. They looked like men at the time. Looked like they had 5 o'clock shadows at noon. And I'm thinking, wow, what am I doing here amongst all these great athletes that had come to the university? But things work out, and you get a chance and get an opportunity, and you all of a sudden find yourself in a position to be able to become a starting running back. And so that happened my junior year, and that junior year we get a magical season and become national champions that year. Yeah. And was a great season. And then the following year I was voted captain of the football team, and so we had lost a couple of games that season. But anyway, it was a great experience for us, or at least for me, to be able to play at Notre Dame. One of the interesting things about the success of Notre Dame during that period of time was not only era coming in, but also the NCAA had a big impact in changing the rules of the game. Prior to 1964, there was only 3 substitutions on the change of the ball. So most players had to play both ways. So when you were recruiting, your fullback was a middle linebacker, or and so offensive tackles were defensive tackles, and so people had to play in this within that framework. So when Era came in, they changed that rule. So he had a plethora of good athletes. Now he was able to move them around. And so that first year, the year before, I think they only won 2 games. That first year he comes in, he goes 9-1 and changes the whole program around, and all of a sudden Notre Dame comes back on the forefront of college football just because of that dramatic turnaround. But he had the talent to be able to do that. And then he'd take, we had big running backs, like 6'4", 225 pounds, and he made them offensive tackles. Wow. Just great athletes and movement. And we had a fullback, Pete Duranko, is from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And Pete was like 245, big fullback. Yeah. And they made him a defensive tackle. He became an All-American defensive tackle, but he had that quickness and and agility to be able to play as he did as a running back, now as a defense. So given all that, so now Era puts Notre Dame back on the forefront, and thus by my junior year, because of the fact that we were his first recruited class, he molded that class into by sophomore. People always have to understand that as freshmen, we did not play. Right. Freshmen could not play at that time. So by your sophomore year, if you weren't either a starter, you then became the backup. And so the whole backup with the second string was all sophomores. And so I got a chance to play as a sophomore. And then as a
Rock,
junior.
If you would have had to play both ways, where would you have played on the defensive side of the ball?
So that would have been probably as defensive back, because in high school you played both ways. You
sure, yeah, absolutely.
Or linebacker, but in high school you could do that. Probably a defensive back, probably a safety or of some nature or whatever it might have been. But yeah, that's what we would have done.
You always have pretty good wheels, if I remember correctly.
I should say this. I had good balance. I had good quickness. I necessarily wasn't fast. Right. I didn't have great acceleration speed. But in the game of football, if you got a 4 or 5 yard average, you're not doing too shabby.
Right, exactly.
So it's coming off the ball and being able to read those holes quickly were the things that would get you through.
So, national championship, you move on. Before we get into talking about you getting drafted and things like that, let's talk a little bit about your book, Fighting Back. You talk about your journey, your life when you went to the military, you were drafted, active duty. Can you just touch on a little bit about that?
Well, is that, within the book, when we wrote the book, basically we wrote it back in 1974, or at least the first edition of it came out when we were going to the Super Bowl. And that's where it started, going to the Super Bowl and what that was like. And then it had a reflection on, life and going through all we were talking about and going to Notre Dame. And ultimately the service became a big part of it. And then they come back and trying to make the team again and getting an opportunity to do so. So in the new edition of the book, I added some extra chapters at the end, just to bring things up to date and about my girls and my family and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so all of us have challenges, in our lives and what we do and what we have to overcome. You probably learn from them more than you can if you're successful all the time, and I understand, or at least in my perspective, is what allowed me to come out of high school, to go to college. Wasn't me. It was the success of the team. It Sure. was that, and being part of it. I always tell people, you get recognized, then for your contribution. If you were playing on a losing team, you really had to be a standout before you got recognized. But if you're playing a successful team, then everybody's looking at everybody on the team, and then you get recognized for that part of what you do. Absolutely. So that allowed me to get to the Steelers coming out of college because it was the same thing. I wasn't the leading ground gainer for Notre Dame. I wasn't the #1 running back for Notre Dame. I wasn't an All-American for Notre Dame. I was just a good, consistent ball player that played on a team that at least drew the attention of people. And back at that time when there were 17 rounds in the NFL draft, there wasn't free agency as much as they have today. But then they just go, okay, who's breathing?
Yeah.
who's left?
Yeah.
We'll just take them to fill in those spots. So,
you were what, pick number 417th in the 16th round.
I was the 16th round. And so my mental set was that, hey, there were 17 rounds. At least that was not the last guy picked.
Yep, that's right.
I might be able to make this team. People say, well, how'd you make the team back then? Well, remember who played for the Steelers in the 60s? That's how come I made the team, because nobody can remember who played for them during that period of time. But anyway, so I got a chance to, come to Pittsburgh, and then there was this conflict that was taking place called Vietnam during that period of time. Yeah. And so there was the draft, the military draft that you had to come to terms with, because everybody was being drafted, unlike today, where that doesn't exist anymore. And but it was prevalent back then. Yeah. They needed manpower, and they needed bodies, and so the only way to be able to do that was to draft students coming out of high school. You got a college deferment if you went to college and didn't flunk out. So that bought you 4 more years, but then you were eligible after that period of time. And so, like all the other ball players, I became eligible. Some had injuries, some were, bigger and were out of the scope of size that was acceptable by the military. I fell right in the middle of that. And what happens, and you kind of fall through the cracks of what took place. And I get my draft notification. And within a short period of time, I'm in the military, going through basic training, Vietnam, and then being in conflict, and ultimately getting wounded twice in the same day. And then going through that process, and then getting out, and then going through a process of trying to make the Steelers again. So that becomes part of that history and the story within the book, Fighting Back.
That's the perfect title, almost the perfect title for your life. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, everything that you fought through, but from your story about you sitting down with those guys at the table for your first meeting at Notre Dame to, going to conflict, what was your expression when you got your draft notice? Were you kind of like, oh my God, I don't believe this?
Well, so it kind of all, and you're right. And I didn't believe it. I suppose somewhere in the back of my mind, and if I was honest, it was the possibility was floating around there. Okay, sure. Fine. But it was like I thought, okay, what I had learned was that you make a professional football team, they will take care of that obligation.
Yeah.
Meaning, in my world, well, they would put you in the reserve or the National Guard, and would take care of that obligation. And they would help you do that. So that's what I was thinking. Probably one of the probably happiest days of my life was my rookie year in training camp. Towards the end of training camp, and I was walking out of a meeting, and Bill Austin was our head coach at the time. And he said, "Can I talk to you for a moment?" And I said, "Oh, sure." And so he pulled me aside and he said, "Listen, this letter came in the mail and was opened accidentally. And it was my 1A classification, which put me back into being drafted, or the eligibility of being drafted." And he said, "We think you're good enough to make this team, and we will take care of this for you." Oh, wow. I made the team. That's all I heard was,
yeah, sure.
They're thinking, go. And so anyway, so that kind of put it in my mind that okay, we'll go on. But time went on. Now it was 1968. And I tell you this only because of the height of the war. We had the most military personnel over in Vietnam. We had over 500,000 troops over there. Reserves were filled. National Guards were filled. And so ultimately, I just kind of, time went by, slipped through the cracks, and I got my draft notification from my local draft board to say, hey, we've drafted you. And boom. And then I was gone for short. It didn't take long, and boom, I was in basic training.
Yeah.
But it was like, so, you talk about a lot of that. I should tell you this, one of the stories is that when I first got to Pittsburgh, I mean, honest to goodness, I first got to Pittsburgh as a rookie. So I drove all the way from Appleton, Wisconsin. I stopped in, I stopped in Chicago. I stopped in South Bend, and then I'm driving to Pittsburgh. And I know one family, I'm going to tell you this, one family that I had met who lived in New Kensington.
Wow.
Pennsylvania. People are saying, well, that's right outside of Pittsburgh, just to let you know.
I'm from Vandergrift originally.
Oh, you're okay, fine. So, but I didn't know where New Kensington was. And so yeah. I find my way. I got a map. I'm going, there was no GPS. Okay, listen, I got a map. So I get to their house, and we have dinner that night. And I have to report to the Roosevelt Hotel, downtown Pittsburgh. That's where the Steelers office was located, and that's where we're going to get our physicals. And so I had to report the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. They let them know I was there. So I leave their house, I'm saying around 10 o'clock, and they go, okay. I said, well, how do I get to the Roosevelt Hotel? He said, oh, it's very easy. Just take 28 south, and you'll come to the Heinz plant, and just take a left over the Heinz plant, and cross the bridge, and you'll be right there.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Except they forgot to tell me there's 43 bridges from there to the Heinz plant. And so anyway, I got over there, and all of a sudden I found myself, and people have to understand that Pittsburgh is built on a triangle down to the point. Okay. Yep. So the Roosevelt was on the corner of 6th and Penn. That I knew, the corner of 6th Street and Penn Avenue. All of a sudden, I'm on Grant Street, and I don't know, Grant Street, I don't know, okay, what's Grant Street? So then I see 7th Street. Okay, so I said, okay, 7th Street. I'll just go down 7th. I'll go down 7th Street. And then it will, then I'll just go over one block to 6th. I go down to 7th Street, and it turns into 9th Street. Oh, man. So all of a sudden, I'm back on Grand Avenue again. So I go down to 5th Street. So 5th Street, it turns into 3rd Avenue. I'm going, oh, man. All of a sudden, I find myself at a stoplight on the corner of 6th and Penn. I made it. The Roosevelt Hotel is right there. Across the street, catty corner, was a parking garage. I'm not screwing up anything. I'm pulling right into the parking garage. First spot. I don't know, I pull in. I take an overnight kit out. Now, you have to understand, I packed everything that I owned in that car. Sure. Just in case I wasn't going to make this team.
What kind of car?
What did I have? Oh, I'll have to think about that.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm curious.
I forgot what car I had. Oh, I had I had a Mustang.
Nice.
Nice.
Nice. I can envision it too, because my neighbor had one.
No. Yes, I had a 1966 Mustang convertible.
Yeah.
And so that's the way. And so anyway, so I had my golf clubs in there. I had all my clothes in there. I had my football shoes, because you had to bring your own football shoes to training camp, and my luggage, except my overnight pack. And so I went to the hotel and checked in, got a room, got up the next morning, and had my physical, we did what we needed to do. Then we're heading up to training camp. Yeah. And I went out to the car to put my overnight bag in, and everything is gone. Oh, gosh. Somebody broke into my car and left me with nothing but the clothes on my back. That's all I had. And I go up to training camp. And so I had no football shoes.
That's amazing.
So things, change. So overcoming obstacles. That was my first one at that time. So,
who took you under their wing? Who said, here, I got an extra pair of shoes you can use?
Tony Parisi, the equipment guy.
Oh, and, yeah.
Yeah. So he was the equipment guy at the time, and Tony was, and just for your listeners out there, just to put in perspective, and Tony was a great guy. Tony actually was an Italian Canadian by birth, and he played hockey. That's what got him here to the States. And then he played with some farm teams in Johnstown and Hershey and so on. And so got him to Pittsburgh, whatever. And then he got in with the Steelers, and I think he was working with the Penguins at the time, but then got into the Steelers, and he was their equipment guy. He was a great guy. But anyway, he's the one that took me.
He was there forever too, wasn't he?
He was forever. Yeah, they all were. But yeah, Tony was.
Yeah, that's a deep organization. The chief, I mean, let's face it, Art Rooney Sr., he took care of everybody. He brought you in. You were family. How was it with the chief? What was that like? Well, my favorite stories about him were when he used to come into the locker room. I was a little kid, but you fall in love with the Pittsburgh Steelers if you're from Pittsburgh. Right. They're as hardworking of a team as the people that lived in that city. But the chief, he embodied everything Pittsburgh. What was that all about with him?
Well, so I had to learn about the chief, and you learned about the just through the period of time of being here over all the years, and especially having played with him. So a couple chief stories. My first experience with the chief was the next morning after the night that I checked in, and before the 8 o'clock meeting, I went downstairs to have breakfast. Mm-hmm. And I was standing in line when I get a tap on my shoulder, and it was one of the scouts, and he said, "You're Rocky Bleier." And I go, "Oh, yes." And he said, "Hey, Chief." Mr. Rooney was standing right behind him. He said, "Here's one of your draft choices, Rocky Bleier." "Oh, how are you doing?" "Fine. Come and join us for breakfast." So my first morning there is I had breakfast with the chief. Wow. And sat down. I couldn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I know what a great honor it was, but it was in my memory to be able to do that. So the other thing too is that the chief, chief is the chief, and he was you're a rookie, you don't have much contact and so on. But I was in the service, and I was on leave after I came back and was in the hospital, and I stopped in on my way back to Wisconsin to Pittsburgh, and I stopped in to see whether or not I walked in and to see the business manager basically, mm-hmm. because my contract was basically, I missed 4 games, okay, and I made $15,000 a year. It was, there was a signing bonus and plus this and a little bit, but anyway, I had 4 games that had a paycheck. There was like $1,500, okay, which doesn't sound like much today, but $1,500 back then was good. Yeah. And so I sat and I said, I was just wondering if whether or not I might be eligible, because part of my contract was playing 50% of the time. I had a bonus. Oh, that was it. I had a bonus. There was a $1,500 bonus. That was it. Not the games that I lost, but the $1,500 bonus. I said, "Do you think it's possible to be able to, maybe get that $1,500 bonus?" Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, you didn't play in your position 50% of the time. That's what the contract says. And all of a sudden, through the wall, I hear this. Give him what he wants. And it was Mr. Rooney.
Yeah.
He didn't come out. He didn't say, he said, give him what he wants. Oh, okay, fine. So they gave me a check for $1,500. But that was the kind of guy that he was. And, you know, one of the other things was that they were doing a shoot. This was later on about the stadium. This was over at Three Rivers back in the early part of the 70s. And
Sure.
We moved over to Three Rivers Stadium. And they were doing a thing on the Steelers, but they did a thing with Mr. Rooney. And he took them on a tour throughout. And he was very proud of the stadium and what had been created and so on, and where the Steelers were playing. And so he took them on the tour. And he stopped at every water fountain, and he just pressed the water fountain button. And so he did this, and nothing was said. And they came back, and after the little tour, and they said, he said, Chief, he said, Mr. Rooney, he said, I'd like to ask you a question. You know, what was, I noticed that, you know, I mean, you stopped and pressed the button on every water fountain. He said, can we ask you why you did that? He said, because it's my business.
Yeah.
And so he was in tune with, you know, making sure that the water fountains work, because if the water fountains worked, then everything else worked. And he, you know, because that he took ownership and all that kind of stuff. And so he was just, he was a great guy. He was an owner that took care of his players and took the time to get to know his players. And, you know, you'd be walking by his office, and all of a sudden he'd say, hey, Rock, come in here. Or Joe Green or Terry Bradshaw, you know, say, come in here, you know. And so he'd sit down there. You want a cigar? Go, do you want a cigar?
Yeah.
Oh, you'd be smoking. Then he'd tell you stories. He would just start talking. He would tell you stories about the early days and about people that he met, and, you know, and playing the horses and so on and so on and so on. And so it was really an educational kind of a guy. But you played for him because he was just that kind of guy that was a good guy.
He made it a family environment for you guys, right? I mean,
it was very much that you'd like to say that. Yeah, that was it, you know, and he did, you know, he was, you know, and the great thing about it was this, from an organizational point of view, and I've always told people this, you know, is that from a player's perspective, you know, there was a linear responsibility. So owners like Mr. Rooney, and then his son Dan, who took over, and then Art, who took over for his father Dan. But for Mr. Rooney, you know, owners did owner business. They weren't trying to influence the coach. They didn't come in and try to, you know, be a player. They weren't trying to be a coach. We had no general manager at the time. The next thing was the head coach. He was kind of like responsible, you know, for the team and for the players. And they made those decisions. And it wasn't like an owner making a decision. It was the coach making a decision. And so for a player, you know, okay, where the power structure was or what was needed to be done, and it wasn't confusing. So so that I thought was very important. And they still run the club that way. Yeah. We have a general manager now, but it works very well with the coaching staff. And so it was that kind of a family unit.
It's kind of a blessing to, when you think back, 3 head coaches since you were basically since you started with that organization. That's all that's really been there. Like nobody else can say that. No, they can't. And it's just amazing. And what, just a couple of general managers. You had Colbert, and who was it before Colbert?
Yeah, he was a quote the first titled general manager, Kevin Colbert.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing the way they do business. You know, okay, so the Steelers don't win the Super Bowl every year. Let's get our panties all up in a bunch. But generally speaking, I mean, the way they do business today is the way they did it when Rocky Bleier played.
Very much so. And I think this is that if you're going to spend, and I don't know, well, I think it's a mentality, but if you're going to spend the time to search for your next head coach, and you put the time and the effort to do your job as an owner for the quality of person that you're bringing into that position. It's not only knowing football, but it's being a human being, the interaction that you have with players. What's your philosophy? You know, what's your take on life? So if you spend the time, then you got to give that coach the time to be able to develop his team. You know, success is based on a long-term process. I mean, it's very difficult to come in and, you know, and change. You can change a culture. If you've got a bad culture, you know, you can get people to start to win right away and so on, and get people to believe in you. After 40 years of the losingest team in the world, that takes some time to be able to do that. But that's what they did with Chuck. And they got a guy that had the same values, ideas of the Rooney family, but also a guy who could coach and who did it and was here for 26 years?
Yeah. What made him special, Rock? I mean, I know you said he had the same values, the same mentality. I get it. Like, I get that piece of it.
Yeah.
But what made him special? I mean, this guy won 4 Super Bowls in the 70s. You won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years.
Right.
And that was without free agency.
And I think part of that was because there wasn't free agency. Now, it doesn't take anything away from the coaching staff. So from the coaching staff, you know, Chuck allowed his Chuck did not have an ego. I mean, he did have an ego, but it was an outward ego. It wasn't, you know, something that he needed to be stroked all the time. And so his assistant coach, and he was good at getting us good assistant coaches. Yeah. And he allowed them to do what they do in teaching their positions. And having an offense and defensive game plans. Now, their offense and defensive game plans were relatively simple. Okay, I mean, from a terminology point of view, there wasn't complex to begin with, and so because you need to get players to buy into that system and understand it, what you want to be done. So if it becomes too complex, well, then you're thinking, and you can't allow players to think out there, you know, so they have to react to the situation. So Chuck was good at that. His expectations were normal expectations. You are a professional football player. So because of that, there are certain standards in which I want you to, which you do, which is we have rules. Okay, we have rules because we need to be able to keep order within the confines of this team and within your life. Okay, all I want you to do is just abide by the rules, which are be here on time, don't be late. You know, we have curfew, and the reason we have a curfew is because we work hard during the day, and so we don't want you to be out late at night, and we need you to get your sleep. Okay, during training camp as well. Once training camp is over, there's not much we could do, but during training camp and so on. And that's it. I don't want your money, so I don't want to fine you, but we have to have fines if you're late or if you're doing this to keep you in intact. So if you just do what you're supposed to do, you know, then we will get along fine. And that's the kind of guy that he was. So his expectations, he wasn't a yeller, he wasn't a screamer. He wasn't a player's coach. I mean, he wasn't a rah-rah kind of guy that needed reinforcement from his players. He was kind of like you, a teacher, a professor of sorts. He had this knowledge and he wanted to impart it. I asked this question with a couple of my teammates. It was after I said, after we got retired and so on. So how would you describe Chuck, much like you asked me? And so Terry Hanratty, who was our quarterback during it, Butler, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Butler.
He and I played at Notre Dame together.
Oh, that's right.
That's right. And so, and Terry was Terry's locker was right next to mine. And so he said, you know, Chuck was, as I was talking about, he said, very even-tempered, you know, very kind of calm, cool, mm-hmm. Wasn't a yeller, wasn't a screamer, but he just kind of made you feel uncomfortable. You were never comfortable around Chuck, you know, so he always kept you on a little edge, part of his personality, you know, and so, so that you just didn't know, you know, of what it was. And that edge, you know, brought the best out of guys. Yeah. And he knew, you know, he knew when to talk to a player, and he also knew when peer pressure came very important within the organization. So that pressure that would come by other players on how you should play and or act becomes a reinforcement of what his ideals were.
Why did him and Bradshaw butt heads or appear to butt heads?
Well, I think that I think this, and it's not that they. I think from Chuck's point of view, and this is tongue in cheek, and I'm just telling your
perfectly fine. You say it as politically correct as you want to say it. I'm fine.
No, is that I think if I should say, let's go back. If I should say Roger Staubach, I know instantly there's an image that pops into your mind about Roger Staubach.
Yeah.
If I should say Terry Bradshaw, there's an image that pops in your mind about Terry Bradshaw. And those two images aren't the same.
No,
they're not. Okay.
No.
So Chuck would have loved to have Roger Staubach, but he got Terry Bradshaw. And I say Roger only from the point of view that image that you have, you know, a student, a game, methodical, kind of a leader, you know, on the team.
A Navy guy.
Navy guy, red defenses, you know, so on and so on and so on. What you got was a Louisiana boy that could throw long and deep, you know, and maybe one of the saving graces of Terry today, you know, in his broadcasting career, he came across like a golly gee good old boy down in that southern point, not real bright, and so on. And he made his mistakes, you know, along the way. But, you know, things would take place. So I always paint this picture to some degree. So as we're preparing for a game, the quarterbacks would sit with Chuck, and they would go over the opposing film of the opponent.
Sure.
And it would be a down and distance situation. Yeah. You know, what are their tendencies? What do they do on 1st and 10, 2nd and short, 2nd and long, plus territory, minus territory? You know, what are their tendencies? Because all teams have tendencies in which they best perform in those. And so as a quarterback, if you can kind of get that pre-read of what they may do given the circumstances, then it might be easier for you to pick them apart and adjust the routes or whatever needs to be done. So, okay, so we're playing the Cleveland Browns. Okay, it's 3rd down and 12. We got the ball on the 40-yard line. Chuck stops the film. All right, Brad, what's the pre-read? Well, let me see. It looks like a cover 2. I don't know. I'm in that cornerback's up a little. Could be a 3-man, but that linebacker over here said, can you roll it up a half a frame, Chuck? So anyway, Chuck goes, oh, okay, fine. So the actual situation takes place. We're playing the Cleveland Browns, and we find ourselves in that situation. Yeah. And 3rd and 12, we got the ball on 40-yard line. Bradshaw comes to the huddle and he calls, okay, fine. 60 basic pass play. Okay. Lynn Swan goes down, hooks on it, does a 15-yard hook.
Okay.
Benny Cunningham, our tight end, clears the middle on an angle. John Stallworth goes down 20 yards and does an in. So the progression is, let's take a look at Lynn, back towards the middle, John coming across on the back. Okay. So Bradshaw calls the play, 60 basic, on 2, breaks. Now he's walking over the huddle and he's pre-reading the defense and he's going, well, could be a 2-man. Ooh, I don't know. Could be a cover 3. Heck. Hut, drops back, looks downfield, looks at Lynn Swan, and all of a sudden, Lynn's covered. Cornerback rotates up, outside linebacker comes up underneath, middle inside linebacker takes the hook away. Okay, Benny Cunningham, the tight end, comes open, wide open up the middle. Putt. Bradshaw never throws to the tight end. Heck with him. Waits for John Stallworth that comes open. He gets knocked off. He slides. He stumbles, and he's got to come back. And he comes back to Lynn Swan, throws it to Lynn. Now, on the sideline, Chuck is going, hit Benny. Oh, my God, hit Benny. Jeez, what are you doing? Oh, and he throws it to Lynn. Lynn jumps, one hand up in the air, catches it, comes down, first down. Chuck goes, he's on the sideline, hit Benny, go to John. It doesn't say anything. It moves on. It's a first down. So that's the way we operate, or operated for all those years, basically. And we're very successful because we had the talent. We had great defenses to be able to stop the opponents more often than not. And so Chuck got to, we get the most, but anyway, so the relationship between Chuck, so that was kind of those question relationship. Now, it wasn't until later, basically, as that was the later part of his career, Terry gets hurts his shoulder, and he, in the off season, the Steelers doctors said, okay, fine. Now, don't do anything about it. It'll heal. It'll heal itself.
Yeah.
Terry goes to another doctor, and the other doctor said, well, I can make it 100%. We have to go through an operation, but it'll be as good as new. But you can't do anything. I mean, you can't do anything for like 6 months. So this can heal. So Terry decides to have the operation without informing the Steelers, and he goes ahead and has the operation. So he has the operation in January, February, March, probably March or April, So now all of a sudden, training camp's in July, August. And so he's at home and he's working out, and it's perfect. His arm doesn't hurt. He's throwing the ball, getting ready for training camp, coming into training camp. And he throws one too often and hurts his shoulder. And he comes into camp and he now cannot play. So there's nothing that Chuck can do except go to the backup, backup quarterback, and so, okay, fine. And this was in 1980, I think, 81. Actually, it was 81. It was after I retired. And so, Chuck has to deal with the media, so we're up in training camp. I am now in the media. I am working for a local television station, and I'm sitting at this meeting and so on. First question is, what about Bradshaw? The first question is, what about Bradshaw?
Sure, it's a good question.
Chuck's response is, I don't know. We have to wait and see. And how is it going to affect the team? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
And so the next week, first question, what about Bradshaw? Finally, the word comes down. I said, I don't want to talk about Bradshaw. Let's talk about the team that we have, and let's talk about the guys that we have. There's nothing we can do with Bradshaw until he gets healthy. Okay, fine. So in this whole context of things, is that as we start the season and so on, Bradshaw is kind of isolated. Chuck's concentrating on what guys, and that was his concentrating on this team, what we have. Bradshaw is off to the side. And eventually, he's not even coming to practice. He's not even going to the meetings. And then towards the end of the season, I remember this, towards the end of the season, we were sitting in a press conference after a game. And so Myron Cope, the famous Myron Cope, who covered the Steelers, at the end of the press conference, he said, one last question. He goes, Chuck, what about Bradshaw? And Chuck goes, he's close, but so is Christmas. Anyway, that would the media, who hadn't had anything said all through the early part of that season into 3/4 of that season, all of a sudden Chuck goes, and that becomes the headlines. Bradshaw reads it and he goes, so he takes the heat. Bradshaw takes the heat, and he fires back, why, he hasn't talked to me in 3 months, so on, so on, so on. And Chuck takes one shot back, and then ultimately, being an adult, goes, I can't do this, and so on and so on. But that's where that kind of separation came, and in the media, and then in the minds of the people. And then when Bradshaw was getting inducted to the Hall of Fame, he retired he retired after that season, and then early in the 80s. Anyway, so he's getting inducted in the Hall of Fame. He was coming back to Pittsburgh. He was coming back to Pittsburgh and to do something after being in Canton. And Mr. Rooney had passed away. So he had his broadcasting partner do the speech at the Hall of Fame, rather than a Rooney, rather than Mr. Rooney had passed away, rather than Chuck, and he didn't get along with Chuck to begin with, and or anybody else. And so all of a sudden the media blows it up and goes, oh, why didn't he have a Steeler going through the, blah, 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 da-da. So that became part of it. And so he was going to go back to do the thing in Pittsburgh. And he said, I'm not going back to Pittsburgh. I'm not going back to Pittsburgh. Well, then that became the whole thing, that he was not ever coming back to Pittsburgh. And so that kind of blew it all up and out of proportion. And so, but he came back and, made up,
several years later.
Yeah.
It was several years later. I guess they never realized, again, I was really young, but I never realized he didn't have a relationship with you guys to the degree that, he wouldn't think of having somebody introduce him to get in the Hall of Fame. It just never occurred to me from that perspective.
So and he had been broadcasting for a while, and he thought the best would be the broadcasting partner,
Yeah.
And the thing about it is this: is in reality, who remembers who introduced you when you get into the Hall of Fame?
Yeah.
So it doesn't make that big of a difference. The fact is that, he was a quarterback that he was, but it got here for that period of time, as you had made mention, it did put a distance between he and the Steelers, and, thinking that there was, love lost there. And that's not really the case.
So, Brock, when you think back to that huddle that you were in, you, Franco, Bradshaw, Webby, Swanee, Stallworth, do you ever go, oh my God, I can't believe I played professional football with these guys? I mean,
I do. I mean, in all honesty, I look like I'm doing this with you. I'm doing this with you, not because Rocky Bleier was a 1,000-yard rusher or a great ball. I'm here because I was a part of that, I was a part of that team, and it was a part of being recognized for and I thank those guys all the time, and so just for allowing me to, just to be a part of that, my goodness gracious. People go throughout their whole career, and never get a chance to play in a championship game. It's the Super Bowl game. And so, how lucky can one be just to be able to be associated with that core of people? And primarily, and one of the reasons that success had sustained itself because of the fact that there wasn't any free agency that took place.
Sure.
I think there are 24 players that have 4 Super Bowl rings that were the core essence of that team. That would not happen today. In those 6 years that we won those 4 Super Bowls, they have that kind of depth, and experience on the team would not exist today.
You can't even, and I'll ask you this, you guys won 4 Super Bowls, then San Francisco went on and was a dominant factor. In New England, the last, let's just say 20 years or whatever. But
you're right.
In all honesty, can you actually compare those eras of football as they're played? Because it was a running game back when you guys were there. Then it transitioned more to somewhat of a running game, but using the tight end a lot with Dwight Clark, when San Francisco took over. And now with Tom Brady, it's, get rid of the ball under 2 seconds, get it into someone's hand, let's run to open space, yards after catch type of stuff. Can you really even compare these teams when somebody says, well, this team was the greatest ever, they won 6 Super Bowls, or, can you make that comparison?
No, no, you can't. I mean, the rules have changed, players have changed, the way the game has changed because of those rules. I mean, it is now a much open game, the running game. We used to have 2 running backs, now they got a single running back in there, or they'll bring a tight end in if they need it as a blocker. So there's not really a fullback, halfback kind of a situation as much anymore. And so you're right. I mean, part of the theory is if I can get the ball into the hands of a running back and or receiver, even if it's 2 or 3 yards, the percentage of him making more yardage is really up to him, so the sooner I can get him into an open field or be able to do that, the better off offensively we'll be. So that whole atmosphere of change, and, defensively. So defensively, the bump and run was, something that we made our bread and butter on, and so Mel Blount became a Hall of Fame cornerback because
from right, Brock.
That's right. He just beat those guys up all the way down the field, and he was big enough to be able to do that. So, now they still got 5 yards in which they can, hit and so on. And they've kind of gotten away from even doing that in this offense, or defense, I should say. Anyway, so it's changed. And it's like, it's hard to compare, this was brought up, was hard to compare. We compared, so let me see, who coached the 49ers? Give me a
Shanahan right now? Huh? Oh, or back in the day?
Back in the day.
God. Bill Walsh.
Bill Walsh, that was it. So this came up. So it was so in the 80s, 49ers were really, dominating, playing well.
Sure.
They won the Super Bowl. So the comparison came up, and it's with Bill Walsh, and he had made this statement, said, okay, if the Steelers would play the 49ers, who do you think would win? And his answer was, it depends on under which rules would we play.
There you go.
And there you go. And so it would be, it's hard to compare the 70s with the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and the Patriots and what they've done and specifically. But it was like, okay, what rules? We played back in the 70s? Okay, yeah, we'll take you on. We'll kick your butt, of that team.
Do you watch football as a fan now, or do you watch it and still analytically break it down like I do as a former coach?
No, I watch it as a fan.
Okay.
I watch it as a fan and like to see, matchups that take place. I'm not that analytical or critical about, what I'm looking for. So on. So,
sure.
I always like situations. Okay, who's going to win? What's the situation? Third and whatever. Okay, are they going to make the first down or not make the first down? Let's see who dominates under this. And so I always look for those kind of situations.
You like where the Steelers are right now? You like Najee Harris based on what you saw him do at Alabama. You think he extend Ben's career? Ben might not have to throw the ball 50 times every game this year.
Well, here's the interesting built up or scenario from my point of view. Maybe somebody else has got it differently. So when Ben gets hurt 2 years ago, and he's out, so they have to make an adjustment. Okay, and so they start running the football. I mean, they're running the football, controlling the football, and they got 3 or 4 different running backs that they come and they don't do badly. I mean, it's not as if they were shut down. I mean, they have established a pretty good running game. They didn't have a big power running back or big dominant running back, but overall then Ben comes back, and so all of a sudden they change the offensive scheme of things, much like the quick release. They weren't, Ben's whole career was that he, offensive line, they established a blocking and give them all the time in the world. And most of their comebacks or big plays would be broken plays, because Ben would stand in there, and all of a sudden the pattern would break loose, or the defense got confused and somebody would come up, and all of a sudden they would have a big yardage or score late in the game, and they would win the game and come back and do that. And that was based on, on blocking and Ben and the size and so on. So now all of a sudden they come back. Now we're afraid of having Ben get hurt, possibly. And so then they change it to, it was evolving, but now that 2 seconds, get rid of the ball quick. We got slot backs, we got receivers, we got this, everybody's coming out, and they couldn't establish a running game because it's different. If I'm an offensive lineman, and so I'm sitting there, and I get, and the majority of our game is spread out, quick passes. So my responsibility as an offensive lineman is coming off the ball, quick punch, keep their hands down, quick punch, boom, and the ball should be gone. Okay.
Right.
So we got this. Now all of a sudden, they are starting to figure out defensively how to cover this. But we need a running game to be able to establish ball control. Sure. Well, if you got an offensive line that's all their whole mentality is not based on a running blocking scheme.
Right.
You think you can do that? Well, no, you can't. You got to do that. You have to become that team. You have to become that mindset. You just don't turn it on, turn it off because you're a professional ball player. No, it becomes a habit. This is how we play. This is how we come across. We do this all the time. And so I think that they couldn't establish a running game when they needed to be able to control the ball this past year. So now let's get into my opinion on coaching changes. So all of a sudden, they need to have a change of coaches. And I'm going, why? Is there a philosophical reason why they're changing an offensive coordinator, an offensive line coach? a secondary coach. You don't get along with the head coach, so if you don't get along, whose fault is that? It becomes the head coach's fault.
Yeah.
But you've got along with them for the last 3 or 4 years prior to that. But just because of the fact that you got to a level that was not effective. I mean, in last year's team, you've got an older offensive line,
Sure.
and they're on their way out. And so all of a sudden, I'm going to change this. And so, so the mindset, but anyway, they did it, whatever reason to save face. They got rid of their offensive coordinator, offensive line coach. And now they got 2 new guys. So coming 2 new guys, which is fine, but are they going to change now the offense? Are they going to change the offense? Are they going to change how we're called plays? Am I going to come in with a whole new allocation of how we're going to run our offense and so on? Because now that becomes a learning process.
Yeah.
So I got to learn. You're going to change Ben after all these years. So I just question those moves when they made those moves.
Would you have liked to see Ben step away after last season?
Oh,
or do you think he still has something to really give?
I think that given where they are, Ben still has something to give. I think Ben still, and I think maybe last year was a learning year for Ben, get through that year with his shoulder and his physical concerns maybe. But he did, and so it depends on Ben is viewing, this coming season, and I would hope that he's viewing it like, some energetic young kid. This is something new coming in. Maybe now I got a running back. Maybe we got a younger offensive line. That made the pros, so they all got talent to one nature. So let's get that talent moving and that's what they really need. And that's going to be the big question mark in my mind is how can we establish it?
Rock, do you think in some ways maybe Ben kind of compares to the way you describe Bradshaw? Like, you think Ben kind of, you think he kind of does things the Ben way? Because I know the media in Pittsburgh, they like to bust him out like that. They'll be like, oh, we love Ben, but really Ben does this and Ben does that. And it's kind of like, wait a minute, you either like the guy and you're supporting him or you're just not a Ben fan.
I guess you're right. And, as you well know, I mean, the media is the media, and they got to sell papers and they got to sell stories. And, they come up with, concepts or ideas. And so they do. I don't know much about the dynamics of like being there.
Yeah, sure.
The input
I understand that.
Yeah. And so I get, I do get the feeling as a fan, and I'm sure you get it, that Ben has a big say-so in what goes on offensively. And I don't know whether that's really the truth or not. And I'm sure he does have some input because he's been there so long in the NFL, and he's got something to say about, how we're going to run this defense. But I can't say that for sure because I'm not around there.
Rock, I could ask you a million other questions, but I'm going to ask you just a couple more. Is there anybody on this team today that could play with you guys back in the 70s? Is there anybody who dresses and steps on the field for this Pittsburgh Steelers team in 2021 that could play with that 76 team?
Yes, I do. I think that I think they can. I think I'm going to talk about the physical ability or the ability to play the position, and not necessarily the character and or the person itself. But yes, I do believe that they can. I think Bush can or could have. Can play. I think
love that kid. I can't wait to watch him play this year.
That's right. If we and say I think that he can do that. I think our our wide receivers, I think, can and all of them, play, which would have gave us great depth. If we had those kinds of receivers, I think that they can play. Pouncey obviously could play, and
could Cam Hayward have been plugged on that D line with Joe and LC and Fats Holmes and those guys?
It probably would have made Cam a better defensive tackle, having, he could play, he could play. And so taking the pressure off, I mean, he probably could excel, or would have excelled more from a recognition, knowing you got Joe and you got Dwight on the other side, you got LC playing the defensive. Yes, he would going to fit in well in that defensive tackle.
How do you think this team will do this year? I know the division's tough. Terry's ranked basically, or not Terry. Ben is, he's down at the bottom third. Everybody said he's past his prime. He should have retired. And that's why I kind of asked you that question.
Right.
But don't you think, like, sometimes it's addition through subtraction? I think it was time for Big Al to move on. I was okay with that.
Yeah.
I mean, Pouncey did it the right way, right? He went out. He was still pretty much – I know he had a bad playoff game. I know it was bad down the second half of the season, but he went out at the top of his game.
Right, yeah. So I think a great opportunity, and I think a great opportunity lies in that offensive line, for those who are now playing. So there are going to be names that we don't know, but – backup players. They're going to be players that have played on the right side, their offensive guard and tackle. Like shame not to be able to.
DeCastro.
Well, DeCastro, but who backed up DeCastro?
Oh, you're talking about the young kid Kevin.
That's right. Yeah.
The third round pick from last year just came on like gangbusters. Then they sat him down when Fowler got healthy.
Right. Yeah. And so, So, I mean, he's got a chance, so he's coming in. So there'll be unknowns, but I think they got talent to be able to form. And so be interesting in that offensive line coach and how he brings that talent together. I think they are capable of playing well. I mean, better than I think the majority of people might think of the changes that have taken place. I mean, a lot of people just kind of maybe write this year off. I don't know. I think Ben can come back. He's got all of his other things that are working for him. I mean, he's got his receiving. He's got his receiving. He's got a running back now. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of offense that they create. Within the system this year. Defensively, we're mature, so we're doing fine. Even the backups who played last year played well, as linebackers and so on. I thought they played well, and we got depth. So that becomes a key. I'm more concerned about the depth of the defense than maybe in the offense, because I think these guys will come together.
Outside linebacker and corner. That's
and
they went after the Kerrigan kid. I don't know if you paid any attention to that. They went after Ryan Kerrigan. I call him a kid. He's a 32-year-old man. But anyway, they went after him, and he chose to stay where he is, just up the road in Philadelphia from DC. But obviously they're looking for some experienced depth that brings something to the table still from that perspective. TJ Watt. When I say TJ Watt, what do you think of? Is he a lifer? Is he a Steeler for life, or is he going to bounce for money?
I should say this. That's a hard question in today's atmosphere. Because of there's enough money out there. To say. Is that I think that he has a home here. I think that he has a home here. I think he feels comfortable here. He's established himself here, And, you know, and I don't think he's going to be one of those radical guys that thinks that he's worth twice as much money that, you know, that he should get for playing what he's played. I think he'll be reasonable whenever his contract comes up, you know. But we'll wait and see. I think he'd be a Steeler for life. Yeah.
They're going to have, I don't know if you know this, you probably do, but they are going to have the most money under the cap without the increase in cap money of any team in the league next year.
Oh, that I didn't know. Yeah.
So they're really going to be sitting pretty after the 21 season, and it'll be interesting, especially if, you know, if it is officially Ben's last year. How do you approach this? Do you stay with Mason Rudolph, or do you get yourself a gap quarterback? You know,
right. That's a big question. Yeah.
You like what Coach Tomlin does with them? Do you like his style of coaching? Because he's nothing like Chuck. He's a player's coach. You know that, and I know that.
I know he is, and that he is. You know, but he's been successful. So, you know, you look at what you look at is the body of work. You know, you look at what he's accomplished since he's been here. And, you know, what can you say? I mean, he's come across, he's got the most out of his players. He's a winning coach. He's a, you know, percentage-wise winning coach. And so, you know, yeah, right. What is there not to like? And I should say. So.
Rock, I'm going to let you get about your day, but before I do this final segment. We just got to know from you, Rock. I want to know a couple of the most memorable moments in the Super Bowl that you had.
I got a couple that are questionable. One is I thought probably the worst call ever in football history, not football history. So here's the situation. We're playing Dallas Cowboys the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're down in Miami. Now you might remember this. And it was third down. This was a third down. It was a 3rd down and 8 situation. Okay. On the series beforehand is that Bradshaw hits Lynn Swann in the end zone for a touchdown. But he gets knocked out of the game at that time. He gets hit and he's knocked out of the game.
Hollywood Henderson.
Right. So defense does a good job, gets us the ball back. So we got the ball and we're moving the ball. And the clock's ticking down. It's about a minute, let's say about a minute 30 left on the clock, whatever it might be. And with balls, it was 4th down and 8. We got the ball on our 40-yard line. And Chuck calls a timeout. Hanratty's the quarterback. And I'm thinking to myself, timeout, it's 4th down. You punt the ball. You punt the ball.
Yeah.
Hanratty runs over to the sideline, confers with Chuck, whatever it is. I'm going, why aren't we punting the ball? But anyway, so if we're going to do anything, okay, throw it downfield. If it's intercepted, it's like a punt, we'll make the tackle hopefully, and,
sure.
Or, if you're going to run the ball, Franco, okay, fine, but 4th and 8. So it gets in the huddle, and Hanratty, and I go to Terry, I go, what's the play? What's the play? So here's the play. Full right split. That's the formation. 84 trap on 2. 84 trap. 84 trap. That's me.
Yeah.
Throwing the ball.
Yeah.
84 trap. And it's a tackle trap off to the right side. And I'm going, that's a stupid play. And as we break the huddle, Terry says, run out as much time as you can. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not a run out guy.
Yeah.
Now, Franco is a run out guy.
Yeah.
I'm an A to B guy. That's all it is. I'm A to B. Well, I had no faith in that play, as I'm sure nobody else had any faith in the play. The ball is snapped, count begins. The ball is snapped. I get it in my stomach. Boom. 2 yards. 2 seconds.
Oh
we change balls and they get it back. And I'm sitting on the sideline thinking, well, that was the stupidest play. I mean, I don't know why they should call that an 84 trap. You know, my goodness gracious. Now it's my fault that we're going to lose this game. You know, if we lose this game and so on, so on. So they come back onto the field and so Roger Staubach, we have, and all of a sudden they get a first down. They get a quick pass. They go out to the sidelines. Then he hit Drew Pearson, who's a receiver. He takes it down. He hit him on a 15-yard. And all of a sudden they're down in not plus territories. They're down like on the 17-yard line.
Yeah.
The clock's ticking away. And so they throw. I'm on the sideline thinking, oh, they're going to lose it. They throw it into the end zone once. They throw it in the end zone twice. They throw it in the end zone again. We intercept it. And we win the game. But it was that play beforehand, that 84 trap. I thought, oh, that was
exactly. Did you ever ask Chuck why he called that?
No, you don't ask Chuck that stuff. You
don't ask whatever Chuck you want, Chuck. Okay.
And so I remember then the other one, which was just on the inside. Again, Dallas Cowboys, Super Bowl 13, again, down in Miami, as we're playing them. And you may remember this, and this is when Hollywood Henderson ripped the ball out of Bradshaw's hands.
I remember that.
Okay. And so there was this thing going back, and Hollywood's, his jaws going, you guys weren't that good, blah, 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 so on, so on. And so Franco, now you have to understand, Franco is not Franco's a pretty quiet guy, okay? Yeah. He's not a yeller screamer kind of guy. And so he comes back into the huddle. And very quietly, just very quietly, he goes, give me the ball. Give me the ball. So Bradshaw gives him the ball. And it was a quick trap right up the middle. Boom, boom, boom. And he scores. And he scores the touchdown to give us a major lead, but it was like Franco took control of that situation because he was so pissed, at the linebacker, and so he said, "Give me the ball." And so I'll never forget that. And so
that's a neat story. That's a really neat story because I'll tell you what, I never realized how big Franco was. I went to see Jerome Bettis get inducted into the Hall of Fame, and I was walking in and I looked beside me, and Franco was walking beside me. So I ended up doing a selfie with him. But my God, he had his scrunch way down to do, and I'm like, I can't believe how big you are. Like I'm not exactly Shaquille O'Neal size. I'm about 5'8" or whatever, 5'7". But my God, he was a big guy.
He's a big guy. Right, yeah.
Right. Running backs were big back then.
Yeah, he was big.
Right,
yeah. That's right, So that was it.
Rock, thanks so much for all your time, all your great stories, the insight. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, with you.
Thank you.
Just hearing about your adventures and fighting back. It just seems like that's all you've ever done. And I'm sure you're going to continue to do that the rest of the way, man. I appreciate your time.
You as well. Really, thanks for having me on your show, and continued success and good luck. And our paths will cross again anytime.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
A story of heroes and warriors who played for the glory. We are about to see it in your stadium chair. We know all your teams and we can go on for days. It's game time from the original. Highlights and playoffs and very special guests. It's game time on the original Sportscast show by the FM.